Spring 1943, Bougainville. Japanese pilots spot a new American fighter and dismiss it as another sluggish Hellcat. Within months, that same aircraft becomes their worst nightmare. The F4U Corsair didn't just change air combat, it shattered Japanese confidence and morale across the Pacific. This is the story of how a fighter initially mocked for its awkward design became the weapon that broke the back of Japan's veteran air force. Radio chatter over Bougainville crackled with casual confidence in spring 1943. Japanese flight leaders, experts at identifying every American silhouette, logged sightings of a new blue fighter, but dismissed it as just another Grumman Hellcat. Squadron intelligence logs from Rabaul echoed the same fatal mistake. Entries described enemy F6F types with unfamiliar characteristics. But pilots in the air sensed something different. The first clue came from battle chaos itself, a flash of bent wings shaped like a swallow, but far from graceful. One diary entry from a Hikotai recorded blue bent wings. At first, we thought them new Hellcats, but their speed and climbing were unnatural. Japanese pilots, accustomed to outturning Wildcats and Airacobras, found themselves targeted from above by mysterious attackers. The new American fighter would dive, unleash blistering gunfire, then vanish before counterattacks could form. Wounded aircraft limped home riddled with .50 caliber holes, their armor glass refusing to shatter, self-sealing tanks stifling flames that should have doomed any Zero. Squadron logs from Bougainville described losses with chilling simplicity. One failed to return. Pilot did not radio after initial engagement. The inverted gullwing, once mocked as awkward, became the signature of a threat Japanese pilots could no longer ignore. The Corsair had arrived, carrying with it the certainty that old assumptions about American fighters no longer applied. What seemed like another easy target was actually a revolution in aerial warfare. The confusion spread like wildfire through Japanese air units as more encounters piled up. Pilots trained to dominate through superior agility found themselves outmatched by these mysterious blue attackers that struck from above with devastating effect. Combat reports filtered back describing an enemy that refused to play by the established rules of Pacific air combat. The distinctive inverted gullwing wasn't just unusual, it was becoming synonymous with death. Japanese pilots who survived initial encounters described attacks unlike anything they'd experienced. The bent-wing fighter would appear suddenly, diving from altitude with tremendous speed, then climb away faster than pursuing Zeros could follow. Traditional dogfighting tactics proved useless. Japanese aces, masters of the turning battle, watched helplessly as Corsairs used vertical maneuvers and energy fighting, tactics that exploited raw power over finesse. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Veteran pilots who had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor found themselves outclassed by a fighter they initially dismissed. Early combat reports revealed the growing panic. Pilots described the Corsair's ability to absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese aircraft, then retaliate with firepower that could shred a Zero in seconds. The bent wings that seemed awkward on the ground proved deadly efficient in combat, allowing the Corsair to dive faster, climb steeper, and strike harder than anything in the Japanese arsenal. What started as mockery transformed into recognition, then quickly escalated to fear. The Corsair wasn't just another American fighter, it represented a fundamental shift in air combat philosophy that Japanese aviation hadn't anticipated. Japanese engineers and pilots, trained to measure aircraft capability through agility and weight, found the Corsair's design completely baffling. The inverted gullwing they first derided as ungainly wasn't an aesthetic accident. Technical memos recovered after the war revealed its brutal practicality. The massive 13-foot Hamilton Standard propeller, driven by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, demanded ground clearance impossible with conventional landing gear. To accommodate this powerhouse, Vought designers bent the wing sharply downward, then up again, allowing the Corsair to stand tall without sacrificing structural strength or adding aerodynamic drag. On paper, it looked like a compromise. In combat, it was revolutionary. The R2800 engine delivered over 2,000 horsepower, unprecedented power that gave the Corsair climb rates and acceleration Japanese pilots had never encountered. Reports from Corsair Naval Arsenal described the engine as impossible to match with our current types. But raw power was only part of the equation. Japanese gunners discovered their rounds bouncing harmlessly off the Corsair's armored pilot seat and bulletproof windscreen, glazing nearly 2 inches thick in some models. Self-sealing fuel tanks kept aircraft flying after hits that would have turned Zeros into fireballs instantly. The early Corsair cockpit, nicknamed Birdcage for its complex framing, drew complaints from American pilots about poor visibility. Japanese analysts initially saw this heavy framing as a defensive weakness. Post-mission interviews revealed the opposite. Pilots described the Corsair as iron-skinned, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while delivering devastating counterattacks with 6.50 caliber machine guns. Every feature mocked in design became a reason Japanese crews learned to fear the bent-wing fighter. Japanese pilots had built their tactical doctrine around the fragility of aircraft, including their own. Quick, decisive strikes followed by rapid disengagement before enemy fighters could respond. The Corsair shattered this assumption completely. Here was an American fighter that not only refused to die, but fought back with terrifying effectiveness. Combat reports described scenes that defied Japanese understanding of aerial warfare. Zeros would score direct hits on Corsairs, watching tracer rounds spark off armored surfaces that should have been vulnerable. The thick bulletproof glass windscreen, derided by some American pilots as excessive, proved nearly impenetrable to Japanese 20mm cannon fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks represented another technological leap Japanese aviation hadn't matched. Where a single incendiary round could transform a Zero into a burning coffin, Corsairs absorbed multiple fuel tank hits and continued fighting. Japanese pilots reported shooting Corsairs that should have exploded, only to watch them climb away trailing fuel vapors but still operational. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots had relied on the certainty that solid hits meant kills. Against Corsairs, solid hits often meant nothing. The aircraft absorbed punishment, then returned fire with 6.50 caliber machine guns that could destroy Japanese fighters with brief bursts. Armor protection extended beyond passive defense. The Corsair's robust construction allowed aggressive tactics impossible with lighter aircraft. American pilots could dive through defensive formations, absorb retaliatory fire, and emerge intact while their targets fell in pieces. For Japanese aviators accustomed to aircraft that prioritized weight savings over protection, the Corsair represented an entirely different philosophy of aerial combat, one that emphasized survivability and sustained firepower over agility alone. By late 1944, Japanese naval planners faced an unthinkable reality that overturned their entire defensive strategy. Corsairs, once written off as land-based brutes too large and unwieldy for carrier operations, began appearing in strike groups launched directly from American aircraft carriers across the Pacific. The original assumption, repeated in intelligence summaries and technical briefings, had been absolute. The blue fighter with bent wings could not land on ships. Its size, weight, and complex landing characteristics made carrier operations impossible. Japanese defensive planning relied on this limitation. Corsairs were threats near established airbases, but the vast Pacific offered sanctuary beyond their range. US Navy deck logs told a different story entirely. After extensive engineering modifications, refined tail hooks, improved landing techniques, cockpit visibility enhancements, the Corsair's carrier accident rate dropped to match the trusted Hellcat. What seemed impossible became routine. For Japanese staff officers, this development represented a strategic catastrophe. A captured post-war memo, blunt in its admission, read, "We believed the blue fighter could not land on ships. Now they come from the sea. There is no escape." Carrier-based Corsair squadrons extended American reach across the entire Pacific theater. Every island base, every supply convoy, every defensive position once protected by distance suddenly became vulnerable to attack. The bent-wing fighters could appear anywhere the fleet sailed, which, by 1944, meant virtually everywhere. This mobility transformed the Corsair from a regional threat into a Pacific-wide nightmare. Japanese planners could no longer predict where attacks might come from or calculate safe zones based on known airfield locations. The war's geography had fundamentally changed. The first warning never came from radar or radio intercepts, but from the air itself, a sharp, rising whistle that cut through clouds before any blue silhouette appeared. Japanese soldiers called it the sound of fate approaching. On the ground, infantry learned to freeze at the slightest note, knowing the Corsair's distinctive engine note meant no shelter was truly safe. The nickname Whistling Death wasn't American propaganda. It emerged from Japanese trenches and foxholes, where men had learned to fear that particular sound above all others. The whistle came from air passing through the Corsair's oil cooler intakes during high-speed dives, creating an unmistakable acoustic signature that announced incoming devastation. Over Okinawa, combat air patrols circled at altitude while their engines echoed across the island like harbingers of doom. When kamikaze groups formed up for desperate final runs, Corsairs would drop from their perches in torrents of gunfire and speed, scattering formations before they could organize properly. Surviving kamikaze pilots described the panic as their units disintegrated. Communication failed, discipline evaporated. Each man fought for individual survival rather than mission completion. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction. Infantry testimonies recorded during post-war interrogations painted grim pictures. The moment whistling began, entire units would abandon positions and equipment, diving for tunnels or foxholes. Marines on the ground called Corsairs their guardian angels, watching as rockets and .50 caliber fire systematically destroyed Japanese defensive positions. The sound became more than an engine note. It was the voice of American air superiority, breaking Japanese morale through psychological terror as much as actual destruction. By the final months of 1944, Japanese Air Command confronted an uncomfortable truth that shattered decades of aerial doctrine. Intelligence briefings once filled with confident assessments now carried different messages entirely. Internal summaries began cautioning against direct combat with the blue bent-wing fighter, marking the first official acknowledgement of aerial inferiority. Field reports described Corsair units as nearly invulnerable to standard armament. Squadron leaders received quiet instructions prioritizing bomber interception or outright withdrawal over engaging American fighters head-on. According to Allied translations of captured briefings, pilots were told explicitly, "Do not engage unless advantageous. Avoid slashing attacks. Report sightings immediately." This shift, never formalized in a single dramatic order, spread through oral briefings and squadron meetings across the Japanese Air Force. The language of doctrine had fundamentally changed. The Corsair was to be respected, feared, and when possible, avoided entirely. For veteran pilots who had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor, these instructions represented psychological defeat more devastating than any battlefield loss. They were being ordered to run from combat, something unthinkable just years earlier. The numbers supported the command's reluctant wisdom. Post-war analysis revealed Corsair pilots had destroyed over 2,140 Japanese aircraft while losing just 189 in combat, a kill ratio exceeding 11-1. No other Allied fighter in the Pacific matched this devastation. Japanese technical reports, once dismissive of American engineering, became case studies in adaptation. Late-war designs like the Ki-84 and Shiden Kai borrowed heavily from the Corsair's formula: speed, firepower, and protection over maneuverability alone. These efforts arrived too late to change the war's outcome, but acknowledged the Corsair's revolutionary impact on fighter design philosophy. The Corsair transformed from Japanese mockery to their ultimate nightmare, forcing an entire air force to abandon aggressive tactics for survival-focused retreat. Its 11-1 kill ratio didn't just win battles, it broke the psychological backbone of Japanese aviation. The bent-wing fighter proved that raw power, protection, and firepower could triumph over traditional agility-focused design. For more incredible stories of aviation warfare that changed history, check out our latest videos here on Vintage Planes.